We hear a lot of worst day stories on Ask Reddit. People with emotionally difficult jobs, police, EMS, firefighters, doctors, nurses, therapists, etc. What was your best day on the job? Very early in my career as a criminal defense attorney, I had a black college student charged with a shooting. It was getting a lot of media statewide due to one of the people involved being a professional athlete. After investigating, I became convinced that he was innocent and the actual shooter was probably one of the state's primary witnesses. I had only had a few jury trials at that point and they all were defendants that were guilty as heck but refused to plead out. I didn't have a ton of faith in either a jury or my own ability to handle the case consequences. I worked my butt off in preparation. Once we started trial, I realized I was knocking down every piece of evidence that the state was presenting. I was pumped with adrenaline and growing confidence. I tore up their star witness, who I thought was probably the actual shooter. One of the jurors actually laughed at the guy in disbelief of some of the things he was testifying to. I gave a 30-minute closing argument without even looking at my notes, with the jury nodding along to everything I was saying. They were out 20 minutes and came back with a not guilty verdict. Front page news article in the biggest papers in the state. Client's mom is hugging me crying with relief in one of the photos. That guy still calls me up once a year to check in. Married, kids, solid white collar job. I always think of that case when I start to have doubt about doing defense work. I got a large justice boner. Great job. Paramedic here. My best ever job was on a hot summer's day in Australia. We were called to an 11-year-old boy that had drowned in his family pool. I was halfway through a foot-long meatball sub when it happened and dang near crapped myself. We were about 5 minutes away, and when we arrived the boy's mother was providing CPR while his 8-year-old twin sisters watched on. Horrified, I checked the carotid pulse, non-existent, and started to take over on compressions. My partner started to unpack the defib pads while our student toweled the kid off. Defib comes back showing ventricular tachycardia, one of the only two shockable rhythms. So we hit him with the lightning and he instantly went back into a sinus rhythm, normal heart rhythm. Kid then began to splutter. We rolled him into the recovery position to help him get the water out of his lungs. In such a high octane situation, it honestly felt so good to be able to successfully revive somebody. I still think about that job anytime that I wonder why I'm in this profession. Psychologist here. I did my year-long internship at a university counseling center. While we normally only saw clients for 8-12 sessions, we were allowed to have one longer-term client to give us more experience. Mine ended up being this wonderful young woman who was deeply depressed. She was an identical twin. Sessions were slow going at first and there were a lot of tears. She worked through a lot and she was much better by the end of our 10 months working together. My supervisor and I talked about her frequently and she watched tapes of our sessions. The next year I was on my postdoc and I got a call from my former supervisor who had just started seeing my client's twin in private practice. The mother of the two, not knowing who my supervisor was, started talking to her about how her other daughter had gone to therapy and how her therapist had changed her life. My supervisor called me to tell me this because, as she well knows, we don't get to hear that very often. This is the exact kind of story I need to weather the anxiety of waiting to hear back about APIC applications. Thanks, senior colleague. I was a teacher in a low-income charter school, which you may recognize as a recipe for disaster. The school was poorly run. We had to provide most supplies ourselves, and had unreasonable and unrealistic expectations placed on us. I was teaching first grade at the time. We had a rule that only one child could be out of the classroom at a time, no matter what. I had 30 kids. Eventually, one of my kids had a bathroom accident. I have to say here, if I knew he had to go that bad, I would have let him go, rules be damned. He never gave any indication that it was an emergency. He did his best, but first graders have small bladders. I got him a change of clothes and minimized his embarrassment as much as I could. His mom was furious. She came in the next day and spent a solid 10 minutes screaming at me. A dean finally came and escorted her away and I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. She stayed at the school the entire day and just watched. She saw what the teachers were going through and what we had to deal with. She came back to me at the end of the day and apologized. She was my biggest supporter from then on, and if I needed something, She had it for me. On the day I quit, she hugged me and told me that I was too good for that place and it was her son's last day too. Obviously, I've had better days than that in my career, but that was a day that gave me hope and helped me not give up my career due to one bad school. I work physical rehab in a skilled nursing facility. I had a young, early 40s patient with a hereditary degenerative condition who had been in different hospitals and facilities for months. In addition to genuine pain and disability, she was being very self-limiting, unwilling to do pretty much anything for fear of it increasing her pain levels. Bit by bit, a co-worker and I convinced her to first roll over, then sit, then stand, then spend longer and longer periods out of bed. Finally, we got to the point where we were able to do a home visit, and you could see her remembering what it was like to be in her own space. That light of desire to go home was in her eyes and she worked hard from that point on. And 2 weeks later she was discharged. Helping her into the car and waving it out of the parking lot was the best feeling I've had so far in my career. TLDR was able to help someone go from bedridden inpatient to home in a wheelchair after months of painstaking work. Freaking well done. Keep up the good work, mate. Policeman in small town got a call to try and locate a woman who was on the heart transplant list. She wasn't answering her phone or pager. Early 90s and she didn't have a cell phone. It was in the middle of the night and cold in the middle of February. I knocked on the door of every neighbor on her cul-de-sac without success. Last house on cul-de-sac, which was across the street, told me she'd gone to her mother's out of town. Was able to get her number and contact her. She got a new heart that night. I'm retired now and still see her on occasion. She always makes a big deal and hugs me. She'd forgotten her pager and didn't go back to get it, thinking what are the chances they'll call tonight. Oh man, I thought you meant she was in her early 90s, not that the events took place in the early 1990s. That made much more sense on a reread. Doctor, I was on duty in the emergency unit in a rural hospital in a third world country when 2 women arrived with 60% total body surface area burns after the gas canister in the school kitchen where they volunteered exploded. Both women were fully conscious when they were brought in. I treated them aggressively, morphine, fluids, burn dressings, intubated both to protect their airways, and made arrangements for transfer to a hospital equipped to treat them further. But this has an extremely poor prognosis due to ongoing damage and associated complications. I was sad but not surprised to hear that the one woman passed away within hours. At that stage I worked in a very fragmented system, and since I did not hear anything about the second woman, I assumed she died as well. For some weeks I had trouble adjusting to the idea that the last thing in their lives those 2 women heard was me saying, "Hi, I'm Dr. So-and-so. You got very badly burned. I gave you some strong pain stuff, but I'm worried about damage to your face. So I'm going to give you something to make you sleep and then put a tube in your lungs to protect them." Okay, paraphrased slightly. Slightly over 6 months later I get a call from the sister on duty at the emergency unit. "There is someone here that you absolutely want to see." It was the second woman from that fire. She had been through heck, skin grafts, rehabilitation, depression, but against the odds had survived. She also immediately recognized me as the one who said, "I'm going to give you something to make you sleep," but she remembered it more favorably than I did. It was easily the happiest day of my entire career so far, practicing for 11 years now. Nice job, man. Fellow doc. I used to work as a janitor in a high school. There were 3 of us in the school, and during the summer break, we were normally given a list of jobs to do, but we were mainly just expected to show up and be on hand if we were needed. This one year, we finished all our work super early into the break, so we had practically nothing to do. One day, I was sitting in a classroom watching movies on my phone, when my friend radioed me and asked me to come to the roof. Bearing in mind we were the only people on staff authorized to access the roof, I went up and walked outside. It was a beautiful, sunny day. My friend had set up some chairs from a classroom and had a bucket of ice with some beers floating in it. We spent the whole day up on the roof sunbathing and drinking. It was a magic time. Reminds of the Shawshank Redemption. Nurse here. I was a student on a cardiac unit and there was a lady there waiting for surgery. She and her husband spoke little English, although their friend was there sometimes to help translate. The night before her surgery, her husband and friend left and I helped her take a sanitizing shower to prep for the next day. My preceptor told me her surgery was extremely risky and carried only a 20% chance of success. Neither of us were sure if she understood this fully, but she knew it was necessary and she was scared. I kept thinking it might be her last night on earth and she was here all alone. Through broken communication, her last words to me that night were her thank yous because she said we were so sweet and caring in a time when she was so afraid. I didn't care whether I was allowed or not, but I gave her a strong hug before I left that night. On the eve of surgery, she was all alone. Regular hospital meal, with little ability to communicate. I left with a terrible sadness. I was relieved when I did see her the next week when she demanded more hugs and asked why I wasn't her nurse again. There are days we see someone for the last time, and sometimes we never find out. Then there are days when things go well and people remember the kindness they received instead of their fare. Was called to a home for a drowning 2-year-old patient. Drownings suck because they nearly always end badly. We arrive on scene and there is a mother holding a 3-year-old and another 2-year-old child is soaking wet playing on the ground getting muddy. Long story short, these people don't even have a pool. Their 3-year-old was messing on the phone and accidentally called 911. While on the line he kept telling the dispatcher that his brother was in the water. So the call came to us. Mum gave us cupcakes and we played with them in the mud for a little bit. Great day. Yep, I've resuscitated at least 2. Last one was this past Father's Day. Cardiac arrest in 3 years and we get our OSC. Furious mother arrives. Dad was apparently drinking while kids were in kiddie pool. It's sad to have to say this, but please, everyone must respect pools no matter how deep. Don't leave the side of the pool, and don't drink when you're taking care of kids. I was a dispatcher for a residential alarm company similar to ADT. I would call people when their alarm was tripped and ask them if they were okay. One day I received a signal from a residence from a glass break sensor on a window in the bathroom. When I called, the lady was laughing so hard she could barely give me her safety password. Turns out she was cleaning her bathroom and when she bent over she farted so hard and loud it set off the sensor on the bathroom window. Silently laughing so hard right now, everyone in the office that can see me thinks I'm crying. Bear with me, I was a case manager for mentally ill adults. I knew things were tough for this lady, we'll call her Zed. She and I were in our mid-20s. When I showed up for our meeting, she had a clear hand-shaped bruise on her face, and bruises around her neck. She cried when she saw my face, reacting. Neighbors had called the police. They made him leave, but said it was he said. She said she needed a clearer report to get to a shelter on an emergency basis. She was scared, but we went down to the precinct to make a report. On the way, I wanted to buy her breakfast. Zed started crying again, because it was hard for her to decide what she wanted because she was so unused to making even that small choice. Oh, and she told me that he had raped her once he came back after the police later that night. The desk officer initially said that he couldn't do anything, because the report said that it was purely verbal. I am an angry crier, so I then burst into tears and angrily tell him to look at the fricking handprint on her face and the bruises on her neck. I tell him more quietly that there is more. He gets a DV specialist, and a chief from the county happened to be there, and he happened to be a family friend, and he fixed things. We got the right report, and I take Zed off to a hospital. I call work to tell them what's going on and ask them to cancel the rest of my day. My supervisor has the fricking nerve to tell me not to get too invested because I know that it's likely she'll just go back. I hung up on her. I had no idea, but a co-worker overheard this and went to our director. I sat in the air with Zed and made plans for her future. What she wanted for dinner, what color blanket she would want for her new room, what her dream vacation would be. I held her hand while they did the rape kit. Throughout the day I had been calling and working with a DV shelter. They picked her up from the hospital and promised me they had clothes and bedding for her. I went home and cried and cried. The next day I was ready to escalate to my director, but found she already knew. She had flowers and apologies for me. My supervisor gave me a full apology as well. Zed never went back. I ran into her and her very nice husband and adorable son about 10 years after. She had gotten her GED. She was working on her BA. She was safe. On my very bad no good days when I am just destroyed. I remember that day. I was young and it was so hard and she was so hurt and broken. We kept going. Together. It mattered. Oh gosh. This really hit me deep down. You're a wonderful soul. I'm a newly qualified nurse. My first placement in NICU. We had a very sick baby who I was told was most likely to die at 2 years old. Her mum couldn't understand why she was there as she was a term baby. I'd been doing research and I tried my best to explain to her mum exactly what was happening and be a support. On my last day her mum hugged me and said thank you. I was very close to tears. I follow a photographer on Instagram who had take pictures of this baby girl for her second birthday. It was that baby. It still makes me so proud that she defied all odds. She has cerebral palsy and global developmental delay, but she has surpassed everyone's expectations and is able to eat herself. Nothing makes me prouder than seeing her thrive. As a NICU mum, thank you. Thank you so much for trying to explain what was happening. Everybody talks around you and doctors only tell you a few things. I still remember the nurse that held my hand and let me cry because I couldn't understand. You people are the true heroes. I'd been designing this machine along with a mechanical engineer. I designed the controls for it and was reasonably sure it would be okay. Maybe a few bugs to work out, but the code seemed stout enough. We powered the unit up, went through the setup cycle and went through the manual cycle. It worked perfectly. The ME said, let's try auto. It worked without a single hiccup. That afternoon, a project I'd spent almost 2 months straight on ran its first product. The cool thing. The place I worked had a development clause for engineering. When you came up with an expansion or engineering plan, it was more or less written in stone. If you went over the date, you were shuffled down the project list. But if you finished before the date, they had a cool little feature. Every profit from that machine from the date it ran production until your scheduled end date was split up between the people who worked on it, since the company figured that money was a bonus anyway. We'd started production almost a month before our scheduled finish. I paid off a car and bought a motorcycle. Nice. That's actually a great policy. Volunteer firefighter. We had an apartment fire. Not too bad, but thick smoke to the floor. Partner and I did a search of the living room, with me leading. I was on the wall under a window when I found a large cage with a small, furry ball in a corner. I called to my partner, Matt. Ferret. We finished the search, grabbed the whole cage, and hauled it outside. The poor thing wasn't moving, was covered in soot, and had blood on its muzzle. Sorry, buddy. We went back in, mopped up a hot spot, and helped with overhaul. When we came back out, someone said, hey, that critter was moving. I pulled the ferret out of the cage and hustled to the ambulance. My dad, an EMT, hooked up a nasal cannula to the oxygen, and we got the tubes lined up with the ferret's nostrils. A few seconds later, it perked up, wiggled a bit, and opened its eyes. After a trip to the vet and a bath, he was good as new. He lived for 5 more years. In 17 years of firefighting, he was my only live rescue. Thank you for sharing this. I worry so much about whether or not first responders would help my kitties if something like this happened to me. Good job. ICU nurse in training. I did my cardiac care internship, just a couple of weeks, and I distinctly remember this one English couple that went through our hospital. They were on holiday when the wife collapsed due to a heart infarction and was successfully resuscitated by her own son, 15, and the paramedics. She was in the ICU only for a couple of days and was then transferred to the CCU. She was getting better each day, and each and every day her husband profusely thanked us. He went as far to bring stuff like donuts, cookies, chocolate etc to the nurses on the CCU. It's not a big team. She after a while went to the normal ward and the next day she was cleared to fly back to England again by our doctors. The husband came up to me with another share of donuts and was so thankful for the staff helping his wife, tears and all. How happy they were they could go back home and see the children again. That's what keeps me going. Not necessarily the thank you house, but to see we made a huge difference. It makes me proud of what we do. They're like I heard Americans like donuts. When I was in EMT school, my very first call I had ever gone on was a fall with a leg injury. I don't remember much from it, but I still remember the patient just holding my hand while I was doing her vitals. The entire time she just complimented me. It was honestly pretty heartwarming. I work as a police officer in a fairly busy city. At the end of a normal 10.4-hour night, it's not uncommon to have 12 calls in my history. Sometimes as many as 15-18. Last year in January it snowed. I sat under an overpass and did not have to move from the time I signed on until sign off. Not a single call. Glorious. The real perfect shift. I used to work at an animal shelter and honestly had a lot of good days to pair with the bad ones. One of the coolest things I can remember happening was a family came looking to adopt a cat. We had a cat that was having a tough time getting adopted, so he got to roam free in the shelter to schmooze with people. Well, this family encounters the cat and they don't just fall in love, they had a huge sigh of relief. The shelter cat was their cat that went missing 5 years beforehand. They instantly recognized him and immediately readopted him. It was a really neat twist of fate. I have a very similar story when I was at the shelter. Cat had been in there for a while. Probably not more than a year though. Family come in looking to surprise their daughter with a cat after hers had been killed by the neighbor. Turns out neighbor didn't kill the cat and they also readopted their kitty. On my boss' birthday, people decided to have a cake for him. Kind of a surprise party. When he got onto the room where the surprise was, he started laughing and blushing. Then all of my co-workers started chatting and joke about stuff, and the cake itself was pretty delicious. That day had a really good vibe, and that kind of situation is one of the reasons why I like my job. I work in a theater. It can be a very stressful environment depending on the type of show and client. A youth group came in for a 2-week show run a few years ago. Some of the kids act, some have technical roles, and some help out backstage with scenery and props. This time around I was the lighting designer operator. One of the kids that got assigned to help with lights was an 11-year-old with cochlear implants. His implants worked great and he could have a regular conversation with anyone. The one thing that gave home trouble was the Clearcom headset. What the crew uses to talk to each other during the show. It was bulky and interfered with his implants. It also didn't give him the best sound quality. During the course of our conversations he mentioned that he could also take an aux input into his sound processor, and showed me the mini stereo jack that allows him to do that. The gears in my brain immediately started spinning. That night I went home and looked up the schematics for the Clearcom system. The one we had was relatively simple. Through some studying of the schematics I determined that I could make a cable that was 4-pin XLR on one end and mini stereo at the other end. This would allow him to plug his processor into the system and hear what everyone is saying. I brought the cable in the next day and we tested it out. It worked. The kid was super stoked, but more than that his parents could not thank me enough for taking the time and care to do something like that for the son. Best day of work ever. I also let him keep the cable I made, so no matter which theater he went to he could plug right in. So many are humans being bros moments in here, but your behavior really hit home. We successfully resuscitate a child suffering from smoke inhalation, and I delivered my first baby on Tuesday. Those were very good days. I know it's not something life-saving like an EMT or a nurse, but I used to be a debt collector for a very major financial institution. As horrible as it was for the victims involved, the hurricanes through Texas and Florida saved my mental health for a month or two. After a year of just being told to frick off and kill myself by people who made unwise financial decisions, I could finally help those who deserve and need it. People who acquired debt because of the hurricanes. I was able to waive fees, credit them back certain bills, discounts, etc. I still ended up mutually resigning, forced quitting, firing so they don't have to pay severance, but that period was nice to be there. To those with strong enough minds to be putting in so many years as a debt collector, dealing all of the abuse, I salute you. I always try my hardest now to be nice and straightforward to legitimate call center workers as to not waste their time and keep the day flowing positively. The first time I ever got a full Christmas bonus at my current job, $6,000 was more money than I had ever had at one time. I almost cried. Volunteer EMT here. Somebody called 911 as they were driving when they saw 2 snowmobiles sitting in a field with 2 bodies lying next to them. Unwitnessed snowmobile collision in sub-zero temperatures? We're probably gonna end up dragging a pair of frozen corpses back to the truck. Hope neither of them is a child. We had 2 ambulances and God knows how many police cars cruising up and down the highway searching for this scene. The caller was still on the line, but he had kept on driving and was nowhere near the crash site. He was also unsure of exactly where he saw it. First he'd said it was near a church south of a certain intersection, but the only church on that stretch of road was north of that intersection. Meanwhile our victims are out there freezing to death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 minutes, somebody realized that a certain pile of debris about a quarter of a mile away from the road looked kind of like a couple of snowmobiles when viewed from a certain angle. Dispatch confirmed a few more details with the caller, and we were all relieved to find that the hopeless scene we were all dreading was actually just a pile of crap some farmer left in his field months ago. I can't believe the driver thought he saw 2 people in distress and just kept going without even trying to check on them. He didn't even bother to get a proper location. CNAI was at a memory care place, rough job, but it was late one night and one of my favorite residents was still up. I had made a mocha for myself and was sitting at a table with him just having small talk. Then he asked what I was drinking and he had never had a mocha before. I made one for him and his face just lit up. It was so sweet, and those small things really make the bad days worth it. During my time as a student teacher I was reading a fairly boring article about Aztec people, I think. To make it not so boring for the kids and so they would listen more, I stopped every now and then and added in extra details and compared things to examples of real life so they could have a better understanding of what was happening. All of the kids were absolutely silent the entire time and staring at me. When I finished the article, a few of the kids started clapping like they had just seen a play or something. They stopped really quickly and looked a little embarrassed, but I don't think I have ever felt so good. Every single student was asking questions and engaged, and it just made me feel so good. I've never felt so great about something before. I was typing a report parked outside of a mall when a little girl who was 3-5 years old walked in front of my cruiser wearing pink gum boots and a yellow raincoat. She began waving at me and I waved back and even flashed the lights. She was super excited and turned to her dad to say something while smiling ear to ear and jumping around. They disappeared into the mall and came out a minute later with a coffee and a cookie. The girl brought the food to my window and I thanked her for them and asked if she wanted to sit in the driver's seat. She was so excited and hopped in the car. I let her chirp the sirens, turn on the lights and even use the loudspeaker to say hello to her dad. The dad was almost tearful with how much his daughter was enjoying this experience and told me that the country that they came from you couldn't trust the police and nothing like this interaction could ever happen. I can't remember what country he said they immigrated from, but it was in the Middle East. He asked me to join them for a coffee. I had to decline due to being horrifically behind on paper already, but thanked him for the coffee and cookie. I think about this day a lot when I have bad ones. It is quite a cherished memory of mine. I used to be a firefighter in my small town. One night we were all hanging out at the station after dinner when this guy comes in with his 2 kids and their family dog. Apparently the dog had somehow gotten into a thing of rat poison and ate the entire container. She was unconscious and having bouts of seizures. We don't have any emergency vets near us. Rural county, and the ones that do require you to be a regular of theirs. He was hoping there was something we could give her, at least until they made the 45 minutes drive to the nearest vet. Luckily we always kept a paramedic on duty and he also happened to be a captain on the department. It was absolutely against both the rules of the depth and possibly against the law for him to use our meds in that way, especially on a dog, but he gave her something through an IV to try and slow the poison. I don't know what it was, but a few weeks later they sent us a really nice card and said the vet told them she wouldn't have made it without the medication our captain gave her. I still have that card. I think they sent each of us one. It's got a really cute picture of her on it. You don't get the opportunity to actually save lives that often as an EMT firefighter. Just the reality of the job, especially in a small rural community. So that one was really special. It could have been vitamin K or a clotting factor. Many rat poisons are warfarin or warfarin-like drugs. A few companies are now switching to vitamin D3 formulated poisons to reduce unintentional poisoning. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.